So once you have your unit circle memorized, when we're asked to find the exact value of something like sine of 7 pi over 6, most of the time people have quadrant 1 memorized well. So you know that sine of your pi over 6 family is always a half. The next thing you have to decide here is what quadrant is this in? Okay, so sine of 7 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6 is in quadrant 3. Because it's in quadrant 3, according to your cast rule, should it be positive or negative? It should be negative. You know that sine of your pi over 6 family is a half, so this one's going to equal negative a half. So this is sort of the process of mental math that goes in place when figuring this out. You see the angle, you're like, it's part of my pi over 6 family, right? My reference angle, because it's part of my pi over 6 family, that's basically my reference angle. My reference angle is pi over 6. I know it's in quadrant 3. Sine of pi over 6 is a half, so sine of 7 pi over 6 will be negative a half, because in quadrant 3, sine is negative. Now, the nice thing about radians is it's super easy to tell what family it's in. You see 2 pi over 3. If that fraction can't be reduced, it's part of the pi over 3 family. Okay, where's 2 pi over 3? Well, that's one of them that is on our unit circle right away, quadrant 2. What's tan of pi over 3? This is where I use the strategy. Bottom number is 3. It's equal to root 3, and because it's in quadrant 2, it's going to be negative. Cos of 7 pi over 4. So first of all, it's really easy to see my reference angle is pi over 4. What quadrant is 7 pi over 4 in? It's in quadrant 4. Cos positive or negative in quadrant 4? Positive. Cos of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So cos of 7 pi over 4 will be root 2 over 2. Now, when you get to questions with secant, cosecant, and cotangent, what we're going to do is we're first going to figure out what cos of the same angle is. So what's cos of negative pi over 4? First of all, it's quite easy to see that your reference angle is pi over 4. In what quadrant would you have negative pi over 4? Negative direction, pi over 4 would be in quadrant 4. So then cos of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. That means that, and it's in quadrant 4 where cos is positive. So if cos of negative pi over 4 is root 2 over 2, then secant of negative pi over 4 will be the reciprocal. If you looked in the back of a book on a question like this, it would have been simplified. Could you simplify this to make it equal to the square root of 2? Well, you would have to rationalize your denominator. Can you see that if I multiplied top and bottom by root 2 and then simplified it, root 2 over 2 would simplify it just to be root 2. So whenever we have a reciprocal questions, we find the one, our regular trig function first, and then the answer becomes the reciprocal. The angle never changes. So with reciprocal functions, notice I had pi over 4. This angle stays negative pi over 4. It doesn't change. You could. Okay, I'm showing you, because in a multiple choice or in an answer key, that would be the answer. But if the question just said calculate this, you could leave your answer as 2 over root 2. You don't have to simplify your fraction. Cotangent of negative 11 pi over 6. So this is another one of those reciprocal functions. So underneath, I'm going to first figure out tangent of a negative 11 pi over 6. Easy to see the reference angle, the family. It's part of a pi over 6 family. Where is negative 11 pi over 6? What quadrant? Quadrant 1. One of the things that I do for negative angles, okay, first of all, are you okay if I write 11 pi over 6 as being in quadrant 4? And so if positive 11 pi over 6 is in quadrant 4, does it make sense that when I'm going in the negative direction, I would go 4 quadrants in the negative direction, but that would mean I would end in quadrant 1? So I often think that way when I'm thinking in negative angles. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to go 3 quadrants in the negative direction. Oh, that would be like in quadrant 2. 4 quadrants in the negative direction. Oh, that would be in quadrant 1. Now that I know that it's in quadrant 1, pi over 6 family for tan is root 3 over 3. And I would leave my answer positive because in quadrant 1 tan is positive. So cotangent of negative 11 pi over 6 will be 3 over root 3. Of course, in a textbook, they would simplify that to be square root of 3. Right? Again, you could rationalize the denominator and simplify that to get square root of 3, but the answer is just fine if you leave it as 3 over root 3. Just like this answer, when we did our triangle, when we drew our special triangle for 30 degrees and 60 degrees, we would have gotten 1 over the square root of 3. And you could leave your answer like that. That's fine. It's nice to see, okay, in this case, if I had left my answer as 1 over square root of 3, can you see when you do the reciprocal, you get root 3 right away? So in some cases, it is nicer to have the non-simplified form there. Cosecant of negative pi over 2. Well, first I'm going to figure out sine of negative pi over 2. Negative pi over 2, your reference angle is pi over 2. This is part of your axis family. And I think your axis family is the easiest if you just think about where is that point, because it's not really in quadrant 3, it's not really in quadrant 4, it's on the axis. It's between quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. What are our coordinates at this point? Well, x value is 0, the y value goes down 1, it's 0, negative 1. And now our big idea is sine the x coordinate or is sine the y coordinate? Sine is the y coordinate, so I can say that sine of negative pi over 2 is negative 1. That means cosecant of negative pi over 2 will be 1 over negative 1, which is still negative 1. It's not bad if you left it as 1 over negative 1. Okay? I'm writing it that way to really emphasize the reciprocal. But in that situation, they're exactly the same. Okay? Sometimes those situations where they stay exactly the same, you feel like you did something wrong. Because it's like, my answer didn't change. So did I do something wrong? In this case, no. And the thing that we're going to work on for the next little bit in class are these questions. Okay? This is combining what we did earlier with locating the angles with just figuring out your unit circle values. So we need to put a number in for here. a number in for here, and a number in for here. And I'm going to draw a line off to the side here for some rough work. Secant 11 pi over 3, since it's a reciprocal, we would first want to figure cos of 11 pi over 3. Some things that you know about cos of 11 pi over 3. You know that the family is pi over 3. You know that 11 pi over 3 can be written as a mixed fraction 3 2/3 pi. If I wrote it as 3 2/3 pi, that tells me it's in quadrant 4. Right? Because on your unit circle, 3 would be 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi would end on your negative x-axis, and then 2/3 is past half, so it's going to end in quadrant 4. Reference angle of pi over 3. For cos, that's 1/2. In quadrant 4, it's positive. Then secant of 11 pi over 3 will be 2 over 1. We figured out our first value. Cos of negative 5 pi over 4. Okay, I know that my family is the pi over 4 family. Negative 5 pi over 4. Well, 5 pi over 4 is in quadrant 3 in the positive direction. So if I went 3 quadrants in the negative direction, it's going to be in quadrant 2. With that information from my unit circle, I know that pi over 4 for cos is root 2 over 2. And since it's in quadrant 2, cos is negative. Third one, tan of 23 pi over 6. My reference angle is pi over 6. 23 pi over 6 is the same as 3 5/6 pi. What quadrant is that going to be? Quadrant 4. Pi over 6 for tan is root 3 over 3. In quadrant 4, tan is negative. So we have to do that mental math of finding out what's my family. That tells me the value. Then what quadrant is it in? That tells me if it's positive or negative. Now that we've figured out each of those separately, now we can multiply things out. Multiplying across the top, 2 times a negative will be positive 2. Root 2 times root 3 is root 6. 1 times 2 times 3 is 6. This reduces. 2 over 6 can be simplified to root 6 over 3. Again, if you left your answer as 2 root 6 over 6, it would be fine. And this would be the exact value. So we had to do our unit circle 3 times and then multiply it out in the end. This is a very typical exam question because it practices, do you know how to deal with angles that are bigger than 360 or 2 pi? Do you know your unit circle? And then can you do a little bit of algebra or arithmetic afterwards to multiply together?